straight away, from a personal opinion, overrated. Iron Maiden.
Oh, you're in it now. We're in it. We're in the woods.
I went for the jugular.
So Iron Maiden, like to be honest with you, I don't find myself listening to Iron Maiden very often. But for me, previously in a previous episode when we talked about Korn, they're a very like sentimental band to me, and they were like a huge influence on me growing up. And it was one of the first bands that I really kind of properly got into and started like diving down. Now, I would argue that they are not overrated. I think they are perfectly rated, slightly underrated, because I think bands that are kind of like their peers and on their kind of level are given a bit too much love, whereas Maiden aren't given enough.
Okay, that's fair, and I see that, and I look at it and go, there's a lot of genres and a lot of types of music that I always kind of put myself out there and try to listen to when I know I'm not listening to enough of a certain thing. So like classical music is definitely one from like the modern age that not a lot of people listen to. So I try my best to listen to stuff like that. I try my best to listen to a lot of free jazz, and it's not always very palatable. Iron Maiden, obviously, in was it the 1980s they were big?
Yeah, I'd say their peak was pretty much the whole decade of the 80s, to be honest.
Okay, so the entire of the 80s, and obviously you had like your Metallicas and stuff as well. I'm sure you will. But like Iron Maiden were just always one of those bands that I just couldn't click with. There was one or two songs that was like, oh yeah, like I like them songs, they're good songs. But as a whole, a lot of their stuff sounded very samey, and a lot of their stuff, even in like say in the 2000s, I thought they sounded pretty outdated, and I feel like they have done nothing particularly special to put them on such a pedestal. Like, I get that they're iconic. So they've got, is it Eddie, the mascot? Yeah. They've got him. He's very iconic. He's a great logo. The trooper with the Union Jack and all that stuff. Cool. Like, it looks great. But in terms of the music, and that's solely what I'm going off, I just don't think they're anything special. And that's just me, because they're like lauded as being like, oh, heavy metal, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest. They're up there with all those names, and they've just never done it for me.
It's interesting, really, because I'm trying to have a think. How can I combat this and then stick up for the Maiden side? As I say, I don't find myself listening to them very much in modern times. I think you'll probably remember when I was a kid, I always had like Iron Maiden t-shirts on and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
I remember like when I wore them t-shirts back in like, we're talking 2003, 2004, and like everyone else around me, like yourself and the people that we went to school with, they were all listening to like the contemporary metal bands like Trivium and fucking Bullet for My Valentine.
All very much of the time, wasn't it? Like the current metal like bands that were in, the artists that were there then,
like Lamb of God and stuff like that. And I remember people like looking at me going like, who the fuck are Iron Maiden? And I'd be like, oh, like this metal band from the 80s, and like, bloody hell, it'd be like 100 years old. This is back in the 2000s when they probably would have only just been hitting 40.
It does tell a lot, that, doesn't it? Yeah. Like for our minds back then saw them as old men, and they were just middle aged back then. Whereas now they are like 70, something like that. They're not. I think they're no spring chickens, are they?
Definitely getting into the 70s. But I think around about, it must have been like the early 2010s, like they seemed to like blow up, and everyone knew who they were, and you'd see everyone in the t-shirts and stuff like that. They had a bit of like a revival. So I think when you get into that area, I'd say like, they started becoming more of an overrated band. And I think in more recent years, they've become less of a band and more of a brand.
I was going to touch on this, that, and there's other bands as well that are going to come up in this list that are similar, that you see people out and about dressing like, say, for example, Alt, with an Iron Maiden shirt on, with, say, like a Black Sabbath shirt on, and they've never listened to Black Sabbath. They've never listened to Iron Maiden, but they're wearing it because it looks cool. And like, I get it, because like like I said, the iconography of Iron Maiden looks cool, and it's marketed really well. But solely on the music, I just don't think they're anything special. And I've always thought that.
I'll agree on one aspect of they have a formula, and they do stick to that formula. But like when you think of a band that, I don't know if this is on your list, but when you think of a band, for example, AC/DC, that have such basic formula that they never really kind of tap outside of. Now, I could bring up some Maiden tracks and even albums where they did dance a little bit outside of their comfort zones and they did branch out a bit, but there always has been a formula when it's always been Steve Harris's galloping bass, it's always been Bruce Dickinson's operatic vocals, it's always been powerful, historical event based. There is a formula, like I can't argue that, I have to put my hands up to that. I think their recent work has been quite lackluster, to be honest, and I know a lot of Maiden fans would kind of crucify me for saying that, but I really haven't been a fan of their last two albums. I think when you talk about legacy and what they've done, is like, to me, I'm not the biggest metal fan, so it must say something that I like them as much as I did. Well, yeah, especially as much as I did back in the day, because to be honest with you, I haven't really got the time of day for Judas Priest or like any of the, I can't even like think of any metal bands off the spot, but them kind of 80s, like onwards, even before them metal bands, they just never did much for me, especially like Judas Priest and all that. It always felt a bit schlock, a bit camp, a bit cheese, and I think Maiden did bring a bit more of a maturity to it with their music and sound, and I think that was kind of the grab myself.
It was very much, from what I've gathered from it, like it was very much of the time. Iron Maiden were very in the right place in the 80s. They belonged, a bit like Black Sabbath, a bit like Judas Priest. They had a formula, and it worked there. And like you said, Bruce Dickinson is very operatic, over-the-top vocals, and the Steve Harris pumping bass lines. What they do, they're clearly very good at. And I respect and appreciate that, but it's just never been my cup of tea. And I've just always thought they're overrated, and maybe it's because of their marketing department. Who knows?
Okay, well, before we move on, we'll give a little. So you've come to the table with Overrated. I think I will rate them as rated. I think they deserve what they're given, no more, no less, really. So I think that's the first one out the way with. So
John has spoken.
I've spoken, and it's true. So what you got next?